They're selling the incursion quite well to their own public. So President Erdogan is happy that this created him a great standing among some of the people in Turkey.
Hello and welcome to Insights from Abroad. This podcast is part of the Middle East and South Asia Initiative in the College of Sciences at the University of Central Florida. Our mission here is to educate, engage, and influence the international community. Today I am joined by Dr. Hakan Özoğlu. So that listeners are aware, Dr. Özoğlu is a professor of history and the director of Middle Eastern Studies at UCF. His research interests include the power struggle in the modern Turkish Republic and U.S. involvement in the Middle East through Turkey after the Great War. His latest book deals with the tension between the secularists and Islamists and the Kemalist project Taming the Political Opposition in an attempt to westernize the remnant of the last Islamic empire. He is currently working on a book manuscript based on Admiral Mark Lambert Bristol's tenure in Turkey. His interviews and essays have appeared in many international media outlets, including the New York Times, the Orlando Sentinel, and the Chicago Tribune. Dr. Hakan, thank you for joining us. So let's first begin with the historical background on the Kurds. Why are they dispersed and why don't they have a nation?
Thank you. I think we should begin by saying that when we talk about the Kurds, it's wrong to lump them as one group together. There are many different groups within the Kurdish society. So all the references to the Kurds in the media, especially, referring them as one group with one interest is not correct. There are Kurds with different political leanings. There are Kurds that ally themselves with different powers. So in that sense, it's very problematic to talk about the Kurds singular. That same is true for anything, anybody, any group, the Turks, and so. But for the purpose of this interview, I think we can. When we say the Kurds, we're talking about the Kurds in Syria, Iraq, and Turkey in general. And in historical context, the biggest question is why don't they have a nation? The idea of nationalism, as everybody knows, enters the Ottoman Empire very late in the 19th century. And then we see that the Kurds, in the second half of the 19th century, making claims for, if not independence, but autonomy. But it picks up when the Kurds realize that the Ottoman Empire would not survive, and many other groups inspired to have their own nations, like Arabs. But as we know, Arabs also are divided, like the Syrian Arabs. So Syrian nationalism, Iraqi nationalism is created, Lebanese nationalism is created. So the Kurds want to have their own nation, but what the borders of that Kurdistan is also very problematic. Now, the biggest issue today that in the international media we face is that why don't they have a nation? And why they are being betrayed. I think let's focus on why they're being betrayed all the time. What we see today, especially President Trump's latest attempts to withdraw military from Syria, is not new. There are many other occasions throughout history, especially after World War I, that we see the Western powers and the Kurds ally themselves, and in the end the Kurds feel betrayed. The earliest one we would say that in the 1920s, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Western powers, France, England, US was not part of that group yet, promised Kurds a country. The problem with that is that was only half-heartedly promised, and when the War of Independence by the Turks concluded, and Great Britain and other Western powers somehow agreed with Turkey that the new boundaries will not allow any Kurdish state. So this is the first time in 1923 the Treaty of Lausanne concluded that there will be implicitly there will be no Kurdish state. And the Kurds felt betrayed then, I would say in the 20th century for the first time. And As we know, after that, the creation of other Middle Eastern states, we have the Kurds living in different countries. That would go into other questions of view. So I can...
The next thing I want to ask about is, what's the current state? Are the Kurds united in their beliefs or not?
No, as I said at the beginning, they're not united at all. They have different interests and different power groups. The Kurds are very divided. In fact, Kurds in the Middle East are one of the most divided groups, and with different interests. So the weakness that they're being betrayed all the time is the lack of unity that they display, at least the past 100 years. And one of the reasons for it is the geography where they live. They live in very isolated, originally they lived very isolated mountainous regions that they could not create a sense of solidarity because the interaction among the Kurdish tribes were very limited at that time. But they're great fighters. Since they're great fighters, outside powers or the surrounding regional powers always use them as a pawn against their enemies. So Kurds, in order to, since they don't have enough power to establish their own state, they always look for help from an outside power. The problem with that is that the outside powers, when they're done with their business, whatever that may be, but usually fighting related, they turn their back to them. And as I said, 1920s is one, but after that, in 1960s, United States is the first time betrayed the Kurds, if you want to use the word betrayed, because in the international politics, the word betrayal should be used advisedly. There is no betrayal. The interests change and they change their position. One might consider it as a betrayal, but in fact, that's just a change of position. So I can keep going that way, but you asked your question.
What are the main factions and which ones want to take independence?
Well, if you want to ask the Kurds, they all want to, or at least a huge portion of them want an independent state. Of course, there are groups of Kurds that are happy with their positions. They integrated to the regimes that they live in, like in Turkey, for example. There were integrated Kurds in Iraq and Syria, perhaps in Iran. But the majority of the Kurds would want to have an independent state. Problem with that is that who is going to provide the leadership of that state? Is that the one that are in Iraq, for example, the Barzani family will be, or the ones in Syria, or in Turkey, the PKK they talk about, for example. So there is a rivalry or power struggle among the Kurdish groups that are dispersed in the Middle East, like the PKK and the KRG in Iraq. And although the fighting portion of the Syrian Kurds, we have to specify that, have close links to the Kurds in Turkey, the PKK movement in Turkey. So in that sense, there's no harmony, and they all fight among each other as well as they fight against the outside powers.
So there's probably some factions that are more hostile, like the governments in which they live, like in Turkey or Syria. Mm-hmm. What's Turkey's stance towards the Kurds?
Well, the what it is that in Turkey there is an armed group. Turkey and European Union and United States label them as a terrorist group. It's called the PKK. This is the backbone of the fighting force of the Kurds in Turkey and in Syria and in Iran too. These are the people who go to other country and they fight there and then go to another country. These are fighting force, so they're not that local. One might think the Turkish Kurds are just in Turkey. That's not true. So in that sense, Turkey considers them a national security threat. But Turkey uses some other Kurds, like the one in Iraq, for example, the Barzani family, to stabilize their power. So,
what about their place in the Syrian war? Are they supportive of President Assad or not?
They are not, or they were not, supporting the Assad regime at all, because Syria did not recognize them until very recently, actually, as citizens. They did not have the citizenship rights and stuff. They were discriminated. They were actually one of the worst places against the Kurds in terms of discrimination was Syria. So they were not very happy with them. But when the region was destabilized, the Kurds found this an opening to rebel against the Assad regime, and hoping that they would take him down and somehow create an autonomous region, not necessarily independence, because independence required a lot of other things, but autonomous region with the help of Turkey. Now, interestingly enough, the Kurds in Syria first allied themselves with Turkey against the Assad regime. So these alliances, as you can see, shift in a lightning speed. Now, today, actually 2 days ago, we learned that now they are back of allying themselves with the Assad regime against Turkey. So, but this is not new. That's what I'm saying. If you look at in the historical trajectory, it is predictable that these things happen. Not just the Kurds, but the other ethnic groups, but especially the Kurds.
So I would say that takes us to the connection to the U.S. and the historical alliance.
Yes, and as I said, in 1960s was the first time the Cold War provided a context for U.S.-Kurdish relations. Now, one of the well-known Kurdish leaders in the international arena was the Barzani, Mustafa Barzani, the father of the current, grandfather of the current president of the Kurdish region in Iraq. When he escaped, he stayed approximately 10 years or so in Soviet Union. So when he came back in 1958 to Iraq, he was always seen as a communist agent, Soviet agent by the United States. But with the pressure of Iran and Israel, the United States was convinced that Kurds could be a great destabilizing force in Iraq against the Saddam regime. So they were fighting against the Saddam regime with the help of United States. Actually, we have now CIA documents open to public to prove that they received a lot of weapons and training by the United States and Israel too, and also allied themselves between 1972 to 75 with Iran. But Iran, in 1975, it was Iran's interest to destabilize the Iraqi regime, Saddam's regime, but in 1975, they signed an Algiers agreement, Iran and Iraq. And this time, Iran betrayed the Kurds, and the United States was forced to betray the Kurds, and all the help stopped. The Iraqi regime attempted to destroy that. The same thing happened during the second Gulf War in 1990s. As we know that President Bush promised them an autonomy and asked them to rebel, and they rebelled, and the United States did not help them at the end, and they were massacred. And we know this Halabja massacre that took place with chemical weapons during that time. And this is the latest edition of the same story. And it seems that histories keep repeating itself. That's why it's important to look at history.
That brings us to the recent events. So Trump recently pulled American forces from northern Syria, paving the way for a Turkish invasion into that area. Why is it that Turkey is attacking this area? Is it that they're basically want to move into the area, or is it just attacking the Kurds?
Again, when you say Kurds, it's a huge group. Turkey deems the fighting force of YPG, the fighting force of Syria, as a branch of the PKK that is threatening the security of Turkey. So in that sense, what they are trying to do, at least they claim to do, is that they're trying to destroy the YPG/PKK forces. But by doing so, they're also trying to establish themselves in Syria. So there are many other footnotes attached to this incursion or invasion, depending on your position. Of course, the countries never call these incursions or invasions as wars. They always call it the peace movements. In Turkey, I think they call it the springs of peace. It's a little funny to see it because a lot of bombs are exploding and many civilians are dying. So what Turkey is trying to do, at least claiming that they're trying to do, is chasing and pushing these so-called terrorists, the YPG forces, who actually were trained and equipped by the United States push them away from 20 miles deep into south. They want to clear that area, 200 miles by 20 miles area, they want to clear it. The problem with that is that the United States withdraws, and of course that area is not going to be left to Turkey. Now the Russians are back in with their own military as so-called observers, but the Assad regime is also moving into the towns.
That's what I was going to ask next. Like, what are the stances of Syria, Iran, Russia, even Iraq from the Americans pulling their troops and Turkey moving into the area?
It's quite interesting because in Turkey, when President Trump declared that he is withdrawing his troops, Turkey saw that as a green light to move in. Of course, after that, the United States declared that that's not a green light at all, and they condemned. But we don't know what behind the closed doors that was discussed. It's quite possible that they got the green light. It's eerily similar to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, actually. Saddam Hussein he actually thought that he was given a green light. So in that sense, once Turkey entered, now other international actors woke up. Well, at least they reacted to it immediately. Russia is one, and Russia is dying to have a larger influence in the region, and this created a huge opportunity for Putin, for example, to establish itself and to call the game, if you will, by using the Assad forces, but also their own forces too. If you look at the footage that is coming from area, you see more Russian flags than Syrian flags in the borderland.
And so I want to just touch on the domestic politics in the U.S. Like, what are the political implications in the U.S., especially that many Republicans have criticized Trump for that move? Again,
all these sad stories at the expense of the civilian lives in other parts of the world, but especially in Syria, the Kurds that we see, are serving the purpose of internal politics in Turkey, in Syria, and especially in the United States. The impeachment process, for example, is one in the United States that President Trump is somehow troubled with. So withdrawing the Kurds and claiming that this is good for the Americans, it is possible that Trump is trying to somehow rally the public opinion for his presidency, because public usually tend to be more isolationist than more involved in foreign wars. The problem with that is that although Trump is using this card as bringing soldiers back, he's not really bringing them back. He's moving them to a different location, like in Iraq, for example. But that's the whole purpose. But it doesn't sit well with Republicans either. They take it as a moral issue, although, as I said, there's no moral issue in politics, internal or international, but especially in international politics, that they can switch. So obviously this will be used against the president. And there is also a legitimate concern, I should say, in the United States, that leaving that area to Russia is not in the interest of the United States. And ISIS is another issue that they come back and forth. So there are many things that are involved in this issue. The ISIS is one, return of the ISIS, and the presidential elections, upcoming presidential elections is another one. And of course, it's not just the United States, European Union, even China, and even the Arab League condemned Turkey. So Turkey is having very hard time explaining and justifying their position, but they're selling the incursion quite well to their own public. So President Erdogan is happy that this created him a great standing among some of the people in Turkey, because in Turkey the elections are also always in the foreground.
Okay, so Trump recently imposed penalties on Turkish officials and 2 ministries. He also announced that he was reimposing steel tariffs of 50% on Turkey, and he would stop trade negotiations with them immediately. We also just recently saw the letter that he sent to Erdogan.
Yeah.
Well, like the news that said that Erdogan threw it in the trash bin. So, do you think these initiatives will actually halt Turkey's offensive?
No, not at all. In fact, it does the exact opposite. It's really silly to assume that these things would somehow forget about slowing down. In fact, it fuels the nationalist sentiments in Turkey, and it does the exact opposite effect in the situation, because President Erdogan doesn't want to look weak, and when that letter surfaced, it would make him look really like a little child, because the language in that letter was quite interesting, to say the least. And of course, that letter is now being used by the opposition parties in Turkey to showing that Erdogan should take a tougher stand against the United States. The sanctions they impose, the Turks were expecting a lot worse. It's actually a slap in the hand. It does not really match what the rhetoric that the United States was saying. And I predict that soon they will stop, and they declared that the mission is accomplished, and the terrorists were cleared. But in my personal opinion, this does not help to secure Turkish interests at all. In fact, Turkey looks very isolated internationally, and Turkey will pay a price for this, because it emboldened Turkey's enemies. It was not a good mood. I'm not sure that it really secured Turkey's interest in the region or in the world. Same for the United States. It didn't do anything for the United States, but it served the interest of, I would say, Iran and Russia.
Is there a possibility Turkey gets kicked out of NATO, especially since there are also many European countries that have criticized them?
Well, there's a possibility, of course, but it's a very remote possibility. They would discuss this thing as a rhetoric. But Turkey is an extremely important country. It's the second largest military in NATO as a military force, and Turkey has a lot to offer to NATO. Turkey is not a country that NATO easily can dismiss. So in that sense, I think this is just a rhetoric. They will talk about it, but I don't really see this happening, although Russia will try to do it.
It's been less than 2 weeks since all of this debacle, but you've seen a lot of serious political repercussions. What does the future look like for the American Turkish relationship?
It's $1 million question to ask a historian to predict the future. No one knows. If you look at that past 2 weeks, the alliances, how they shift. Well, predicting future is not an easy thing to do, but predicting the future with Trump as being president is even a lot harder. I don't think you need magic ball to look at it, and there is no way of predicting it. You sleep, and when you wake up during the night hours, you might get a text message or Twitter message. President Trump is saying one thing, and in the morning he would get another one. So anything is possible. I wouldn't be surprised if he decides to send U.S. forces back in the region. So anything is possible. It's impossible to predict what will happen, but it's painful. But I think we're witnessing an extremely important era, especially for political scientists and historians too, how those in power can change the flow of history. Even with a Twitter message, somehow changes the flow of history and then costs people's lives, thousands of people's lives.
My last question was also a prediction. What about the American Kurdish relationship, especially that they feel betrayed this time? And
well, they feel betrayed all the time. This is not new. The Kurds are in a desperate position.
Will that feel like a different betrayal, especially that they've been through so much?
No, it will be the same betrayal. It's the same story. They knew it. It's not that the Kurds are stupid and they were betrayed in the past and they were fooled again, but they did not have much option. U.S. was I would say, the only option, not only option, but most viable option for them. And they wanted to believe that the United States would stick, because that would be in the interest of the United States too. So what is unpredicted by the Kurds, in my opinion, is that although staying in Syria was in the interest, or protecting the Kurds was in the interest of the United States, why United States somehow shift the policy and did something that is not necessarily against the Kurds, but also many people will conclude that it's also against the interest of the United States. This was not predicted. And this probably would hurt a bit more.
Well, Dr. Özoğlu, it has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today, and we thank you so much for being here and sharing your experiences with us. If you want to learn more about today's guest, our mission, or our program, You can visit us at the PMBF website or go follow any of our social media pages. For the Middle East and South Asia Studies program here at UCF, this is Alexi Sadaka. Thank you for listening.